Hello everybody, a very warm welcome back to another instalment from the channel that is Jono's Graveyard Jaunts. As they say, it's been a while. Now today's video is another one in our true crime episodes. Whenever we think about the medical profession, we often think about highly skilled, highly qualified, highly dedicated professional people who are entirely focused on making us better when we are unwell. Working incredibly long hours, often going above and beyond the call of duty. The COVID pandemic being a prime example of this. During the pandemic, doctors and nurses were often exhausted, working around-the-clock shifts in order to try to save the lives of patients who were desperately clinging on to the edges of life. Now, if we think about doctors in particular, their training lasts for at least 7 years. A foundation course which takes 2 years and then a further 5 years for a medical degree before they are often considered to be qualified on some level, and then their training often goes well beyond this time frame. Now, when a member of the medical fraternity goes rogue, this really shocks and saddens us, but yet we are all incredibly fascinated to know the reasons why they went from being lifesavers to life takers. Now, arguably one of the most shocking cases in recent times in the UK, and considered by some to be the UK's and arguably the world's most prolific serial killer, was that of Dr. Harold Shipman, who many people thought may well have had over 250 victims. Shipman was given a whole life order after a trial at Preston Crown Court in October of 1999. And Shipman subsequently hung himself on the 13th of January 2004 whilst incarcerated at Wakefield Prison in Yorkshire. Now, this prison is known as Monster Mansion. This Shipman case, some forensic psychologists think money was not the key motivator for his killings, but that he enjoyed playing God, i.e. the ability to take life at any time with a syringe that was filled with an overdose of diamorphine, dispensing the contents at his behest amongst his often very remotely geographically scattered patients in and around the greater Manchester region. Now, Shipman never divulged his reasons for killing and took those secrets to the grave with him, so we can only really speculate as to what his real motivations for killing really were. Now, in today's video, I'm going to be talking about another physician who became a murderer, and his chosen method of dispatching his victims was by poisoning them, specifically with strychnine. Now, this chemical causes a very painful death with muscle seizures, severe pain in the spine, followed by respiratory failure and ultimately death. Now, the person who features in today's video is a man by the name of Dr. William Palmer, aka the Rugeley Poisoner or the Prince of Poisoners. Now, Charles Dickens, the famous author, said about Dr. William Palmer, and I quote, "He was the greatest villain that ever stood in the Old Bailey." In today's video, I shall visit the former Palmer family home where William Palmer was born, which sits opposite St. Augustine's Church, where John Parsons Cook, Palmer's friend and last murder victim, is buried. I shall also visit the Lamp and Flag public house in Little Haywood, where many people thought William Palmer poisoned a man by the name of George Abley after engaging in a drinking contest with Palmer. I shall visit the Palmer family grave, which lies in the churchyard of Old Rugeley Church next to the Palmer's former family home. I shall also visit the grave of John Parson Cook at St. Augustine's Church. He was one of the murder victims of William Palmer and the less, which obviously led to his subsequent trial and conviction. I shall visit the site where Dr. William Palmer's house once stood, where he was residing at the time when he murdered John Parsons Cook by poisoning him. Now, Palmer's house sat opposite the then called Talbot Hotel, now the Shrew, where this heinous act was committed. I will also add an old photograph of where Dr. William Palmer was buried below a chapel window at Staffordshire, where he was incarcerated at the time. So, where were these wicked acts committed? The murder of most of the victims, including John Parsons Cook, which eventually led to the arrest, trial and subsequent conviction of Palmer, took place in a town called Rugeley, which lies in the county of Staffordshire in the United Kingdom. Now, the first map shows where the county of Staffordshire sits in relation to the UK, and the second map shows where Rugeley town centre sits in relation to Stafford itself. So, who was Dr. William Palmer? Where was he born? What were his motivations for killing? And how, where and why was he eventually apprehended, tried, convicted and subsequently hung?
So this was the house that Dr. William Palmer was born in August of 1824, and it's known as Church Croft House. As you can see on the signs here, we've got church and we've got croft there. Now what's interesting is if we turn around, it's actually opposite St Augustine's Church, where John Parsons Cook was buried, and next to Church Croft House we have Old Rugeley Church, where the Palmer family plot is, which we'll go and have a look at now. So as you can see, he was clearly from a very well-to-do family, and he went on to become a doctor, and then obviously with all of his nefarious deeds, it led to his subsequent arrest, trial, conviction and hanging. So this is where he was born, in the village of Rugeley in Staffordshire.
Palmer was the sixth of 8 children of Sarah and Joseph Palmer. At 17, Palmer was an apprentice at Liverpool Chemist and was dismissed after 3 months after an allegation that he stole money.
We're now looking at the Lamb and Flag public house in Little Haywood, which lies about 2.5 miles southeast of Rugeley. And this is really where Dr. William Palmer's nefarious acts first started. Now, he qualified as a doctor in 1846, and in August of 1846 he returned to Rugeley. Now, sometime later that year, he challenged George Abley to a drinking competition here at the Lamb and Flag public house in Little Haywood. Now, about an hour into the drinking session, George Abley became ill, was taken home and subsequently died. Now, nothing was ever proven, but basically Dr. William Palmer had his sights set on George Abley's very attractive wife, so clearly lust was a key motivator here too. Obviously dispense with George Abley and then have his wicked way with George Abley's wife. But as I say, nothing was ever proven, but this was really the start of what we think was Dr. William Palmer's poisonings. Now, if we look at his modus operandi after this event, it would strongly suggest that he did indeed poison George Abley. But as I say, nothing was ever proven. So this is Little Haywood, and we're now going to be heading off to Rugeley, where most of the acts were committed by Dr. William Palmer.
Palmer was also suspected of poisoning many other people over his years as a doctor, including his brother, mother-in-law and his 4 children who died in infancy. Now, Palmer also profited financially from the death of his wife and brother after setting them up with life insurance policies. Now, Palmer was known throughout Rugeley to be hugely interested in horse racing, and he in turn borrowed money from a man whom he met at the races by the name of Leonard Bladen. Now, Bladen sent Palmer a large sum of money, but soon afterwards died at Palmer's house in mysterious circumstances on May the 10th of 1850. By 1854, Palmer was in huge debt. Mainly due to his extensive gambling, he began to forge his mother's signature in order to defraud her of money. Now, his mother had incidentally inherited the princely sum of £70,000 on the death of her husband and William's father's death. With his life and debt spiralling out of control, Palmer planned the murder of his next victim and erstwhile friend, John Parsons Cook. Now, John Parsons Cook was a wealthy young man inheriting a fortune of £12,000. He in turn loved the thrill of gambling and was friends with William Palmer, who was also a fellow gambler. The two attended Shrewsbury Handicap Stakes in November of 1855, where Cook won £3,000 by betting on Polestar, whilst Palmer lost heavily by betting on the Chicken. After the race, the pair celebrated at a local drinking establishment, the Raven. However, Cook soon fell ill, complaining that his gin had burnt his throat. Now, Palmer made a scene, insisting that there was nothing wrong with Cook's glass, but Cook was violently sick, suspecting that Palmer had dosed him. Cook returned to Rugeley and booked a room at the Talbot Arms, where he met with Palmer again. Now, Palmer took responsibility for Cook's well-being, and Cook's solicitor sent over a bottle of gin. A chambermaid took a sip of the gin and fell ill, while Cook vomiting became worse. Now, Palmer began collecting Cook's debt. He collected a total of £1,200. He then went to Dr. Salt's surgery and purchased 3 grains of strychnine and put them into 2 pills, which he administered to Cook. On November the 21st, Cook died in agony, screaming that he was suffocating.
So this is now called the Shrew Public House. Back in the day, it was the Talbot Inn, and this is where Dr. William Palmer poisoned John Parsons Cook and was subsequently convicted and hung at Staffordshire jail. Now, his house literally sat opposite. It's no longer there, but I'll show you what's there now, and I'll put an old picture up so you can cross-reference it. The Shrew is where Dr. Palmer's house was. So again, I'll put an old photograph up so you can cross-reference. So look for the railings on the right-hand side with the people outside, and that's where the property was. And again, I'll put a picture up of what it used to look like, and more recently, before it was pulled down and those shops were put up.
Cook's stepfather arrived to represent the family, and Palmer informed him that Cook had lost his betting books, which were of no use as all bets were cancelled once the gambler had died. Palmer obtained a death certificate listing the cause of death as apoplexy. A post-mortem examination took place, overseen by Dr. Harland, medical student Charles Devonshire and assistant Charles Newton. Now, Palmer interfered with the examination, taking the stomach contents off in a jar for safekeeping. The jars were sent off to Alfred Swain Taylor, who complained that the samples were of poor quality. Palmer also wrote to the coroner himself, requesting that the verdict of death be given as natural clauses, enclosing a £10 note in an attempt to bribe the coroner. Now, Taylor found no evidence of poison, but still believed that Cook had been poisoned. The jury at the inquest delivered their verdict, stating that Cook was poisoned by Palmer.
So what we're looking at here is the grave of John Parsons Cook, who was poisoned by Dr. William Palmer. And what I'll do is I'll put an old picture of it up so you can see what it looked like. And this is what it looks like today.
Now, Palmer was subsequently arrested on the charge of murder and forgery. He was arrested because a creditor had told police Palmer had been forging his mother's signature. Now, circumstantial evidence also came to light that as Cook was dying, he accused Palmer of murder, and that Charles Newton had told the jury that he'd seen Palmer purchase strychnine. A chemist also, Mr. Salt, admitted selling Palmer strychnine in the belief that it was used to poison his dog. He also admitted that he failed to record the sale in his poisons book as was required by law. Charles Roberts, another chemist, also admitted selling Palmer strychnine without noting the sale in his poisons book. After the jury had deliberated for an hour, due to all of the circumstantial evidence, Palmer was found guilty, and Lord Campbell handed down a death sentence which Palmer received without any reaction. Approximately 30,000 people were at Stafford Prison on the 14th of June 1856 to see Palmer's public execution by hanging at the hands of George Smith. Now, George Smith carried out the public hanging of William Palmer on June the 14th, 1856 at Stafford Prison in the presence of a crowd of 30,000 spectators. As he stepped onto the gallows, Palmer reportedly looking at the trapdoor and exclaimed, "Are you sure it's safe?" Before his execution, the prison governor asked Palmer to confess his guilt, which led to an interesting exchange of words. Palmer: "Cook did not die from strychnine." Governor: "This is no time for quibbling. Did you or did you not kill Cook?" Palmer: "The Lord Chief Justice summed up for poisoning by strychnine." Despite his denial, Palmer was hanged and buried beside the prison chapel in a grave filled with quicklime. After the execution, his mother reportedly said, "They've hanged my saintly Billy."
So we're now looking at the Palmer family grave, obviously with the exception of William, who was hung at Stafford prison and basically buried outside of the church window there at the chapel. So this is again St Augustine's Church, and it's literally, if I just pan up there, if you can see in the background there, you can just make out the Church Croft House, which is where the Palmer family lived and where William was born. So this is what it looks like now, the Palmer family grave. And I'll put a picture up as to what it looked like back in the 1850s.
So, what were Dr. William Palmer's reasons for committing these wicked murders? Now, clearly Palmer's motivations for murder were financial gain, with the exception of the murder of George Abley, whom he poisoned at the Lamb and Flag public house, where Palmer clearly had desire for Abley's wife, so lust was the key motivator in this case. Now, what is really shocking to me in this particular case is the depths Palmer would go to in order to obtain money by murdering his own wife, brother, children and close friend John Parsons Cook.
That concludes the video, guys. Thank you very much for watching. Can I please ask you to like, subscribe and comment?